Good afternoon and welcome to the University of Tasmania's online series for alumni, Explore. We're running today's event in the Philip Smith Centre, one of the university's newest and unique facilities. Indeed, the building was named in honour of Philip Thomas Smith, a prominent Tasmanian pastoralist, philanthropist and social reformer who believed strongly in the transformative power of education. As we sit in these newly refurbished teaching spaces and a reflection of this institution's recognition of the deep history and the culture of this island, the University of Tasmania wishes to acknowledge the traditional owners, the Palawa people, the custodians of the land upon which we meet, and we pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. My name's Rebecca Cuthill. I'm the Director of Advancement at the University. And it's my pleasure to provide an introduction to the series Explore, which is an opportunity specifically for you, our alumni of the University of Tasmania, to join for lifelong learning and inspiration. This series offers an exclusive opportunity to connect with your peers, find among them innovators, thought leaders, and perhaps even a collaborator. So just a few housekeeping notes before we begin our conversation. Your microphone, camera and raised hand function have all been disabled, so our guests today will not be interrupted. But we do really encourage you to ask some questions, and there's a Q&A function where you can type those in, and at the end of the interview with our guest, we'll have an opportunity to turn to those as well. And finally, this session is being recorded, so you can catch it on YouTube after as well. When British author Peter James published his novel Forced on 2 floppy disks in 1993, he received venomous backlash. Journalists and fellow writers berated and condemned him. James made front page news of many newspapers around the world accused of killing the novel. James responded by saying that the novel was already dying at an alarming rate without his assistance. Although the Australian book market did flatten in 2023 following a boon of customers across the pandemic years, in the year to June 2023, the Australian book sales totalled 548 million, according to the Nielsen Bookscan Australia. And compared to the same period in pre-pandemic, the market was up 82 million by value. And over the last few years, from 2020 to 2022, we've seen a growth in book sales. So sorry, Peter, your prediction of the death of the novel did not come to pass. Today, we're going to meet one of our alumni community who's truly made her mark on the literary scene. It gives me great pleasure to introduce you to our special guest today, who will share a little of her story as an acclaimed Australian and Tasmanian author. Katherine Johnson is an award-winning Tasmanian novelist and feature writer. Her novels include Pescador's Wake, The Better Son, Matryoshka and Paris Savages. She's won the HarperCollins Varuna Manuscript Development Awards and the Tasmanian Premier's Literary Award. Paris Savages was shortlisted in 2020 Australian Book Industry Awards and has been published in the US, Italy and the UK, and where it was the Times Historical Book Fiction Book of the Month in July 2020. And The Better Son was also longlisted in the Australian Indie Book Awards. Katherine trained as a science journalist, holds a PhD in creative writing and works in communications here at the University of Tasmania. Her feature articles have been published in The Conversation, Good Weekend, 40 South and Ireland magazine. We're so grateful to have her joining us here today. And without further ado, let's explore the world of novel writing. Katie, it's an oft-repeated phrase, we all have a novel in us. When did you first start to consider writing a novel and why?
Thank you, Rebecca. And thank you for the invitation to be here today. I did my PhD at the uni, as Beck said, and that was a wonderful opportunity to actually work full-time on a novel for a while. And actually it was to some horror that I was looking back thinking, how long have I been at this? And it's actually about 2 decades. So I'm hoping I might be able to distill some of what I've learned over that time and hopefully convey something that's going to be useful for people, because we've got quite a lot of people are listening in, which is so lovely. And I'm hoping that this can be useful for people who might have a novel in the bottom drawer. So I actually started out as a science writer. So I was working at CSIRO, and in that role it was actually marine science that I was writing about. And that was first in Queensland, then in Hobart. And I was writing about the longest maritime sea chase in history. And it was the story of illegal fishing on the Southern Ocean, quite a hairy-chested kind of story about an illegal fishing boat that was fishing for Patagonian toothfish off Macquarie and Heard Islands. And it was chased almost to South Africa by an Australian patrol boat. And so I was writing about the toothfish and the Patagonian toothfish, how deep it was, what it looked like, all that sort of thing. But to me, there was, there were a bunch of ideas in my mind about what this was like for the people on the boats and the families back ashore. And so it was a bit of an awakening that, I mean, I've always loved creative writing, but in terms of thinking, okay, I've got something I want to write a book about, it was that. And it came a bit out of the blue, but I did really want to explore what on earth that was like, wanted to learn more about it, put that puzzle together, interview people, all that kind of thing. So it was a discovery that I wanted to know about the human story behind a science story that I was writing. That's where it started.
So from that though, do you think people are actually born writers? I mean, are there factors in your own personal story that have really led you to a career in journalism and in writing?
So I think so my mum's an artist. She's a visual artist. She sculpts and she paints. And in fact, I did do some painting before I started writing. And I suppose that creative urge was there. It's a real drive, and I don't really understand it, to be honest, if I had to explain it, except that if I'm not doing it, I get pretty grumpy. So I think people do have that creative need, but I think a lot of people have that creative need, and it comes out in different ways. And writing's just one of them. I mean, it can come out in all sorts of different ways. People might take photographs with their phones or whatever it is. And often we find that we're sort of afraid to take that leap and do that. But I think, if it's calling you, it's something that you sort of feel compelled to do. So yeah, I guess my personal story was my mum being an artist, and having that and seeing her sculpt and have a form that's sort of not very much, and then working away and refining, and writing's very much like that. Writing is really rewriting.
But I imagine some people are thinking, well, I've always written a diary or something else as well. Was that you?
I probably wrote my fair share of bad poetry, and I wrote quite a few. I used to write short stories. I used to write in primary school. I remember the teacher in primary school being a bit concerned about something I'd written. It's very kind of deep and thoughtful, and maybe a bit dark even. But that was just me kind of exploring writing like that. So I did do some diary writing, actually, when I think about it. Yeah, if I was going overseas, I went through Indonesia and I journaled through that. So yes, it is. And it's a way of figuring out, I think. For me, if I'm trying to figure something out, I figure it out with writing. I think it's a bit of a cliche to sort of say that writing is a way of making meaning of the world, but I think it does perform that, and it allows you to figure things out through the writing process.
So you described a little bit before about probably what led you to studying to write your first book, that took you from journalism to something a bit more creative. Well, I shouldn't say a bit more creative, a different type of creative. But how did you get your first book published? What were the mechanics in that? How did you get that first break?
Yeah, so I was lucky with my first break, and I'd encourage people who are writers out there or thinking about writing to enter competitions, try and get things published, try and get short things published, any kind of run on the board that you can get that will make somebody pay attention to the fact that you've had something published or been shortlisted or won something. So I was really lucky with my first novel, which was Pescador's Wake, that one about the toothfish. So I won a HarperCollins Verona Award, a manuscript development award. And so there were 5 writers around the country who got the award, and we were able to go and sit at the beautiful Varuna Blue Mountains Writers Retreat, and we had 5 HarperCollins editors come and sort of stay with us for a while, and we were able to edit our manuscripts. So what a treat for someone to be able to do that and learn so much about, what they liked, what we needed to improve. And I learned so much in that process, actually. And yeah, that was really valuable. So I'd encourage people to try and write the best thing that you can write, and then put it out in all sorts of different ways.
Did you have any rejections before you got to that point, Katie?
I think I was very lucky with my first one. I have had some since. So that just goes with the territory. I think what did I read? I read something recently about if you haven't had any rejections, you're not putting yourself out there enough or whatever. I think that just goes with the territory, and you have to be pretty thick-skinned.
So at the Writers' Retreat, you said you were matched up with somebody from HarperCollins. Did that show you the role that a good editor or collaborators play in the writing experience as well?
Yes, it did, because writing is so solitary, and that's one of the challenges I think of writing. And in fact, I do think it needs to be quite solitary for a while. I think you can show it to people too soon, and then you need to almost develop your voice and have a bit of confidence to try different things and see what works for you before you show it to someone. But then when you're ready to show it to someone, it's such a joy, because suddenly these characters that have been in your head become real to someone else, and they start to talk to you. I remember for that book, Joe, the editor, was talking about Carlos, the Uruguayan master, and these names that suddenly were in my head but became real, and that was fantastic. But yes, a good editor can show you the structural things that you need to fix, and can show you where there are. Some key things about writing are what are the characters' motivations. Is it plausible? Those kind of things. And so an editor will be able to say, look, I didn't find that believable, or we need more, flesh out this character more, or flesh out that relationship more. And actually something I learned, point of view can be quite tricky in writing, who's narrating and how are you in their thoughts? These are all decisions that a writer has to make. How close are you into the the main character's thoughts? And the way that I'd written that book, I wrote it in alternating points of view, but that you have to make decisions around, when you're writing a chapter in a point of view, you can't then jump into somebody else's head, for example. You have to stick to that point of view if that's the way you've chosen to do it. So an editor can sort of say, hang on, you've slipped point of view there, things like that.
Is there a moment when they've said, you must take this away, and you haven't wanted to do it?
To publish it?
To publish it.
Yeah, I think unless a publisher takes your book away, you would keep tinkering. and likely you'd go backwards. It's the same with my mum's painting. She says you have to walk away. Stop, walk away. It's actually going backwards now. And I think that's the case with publishing too. Someone has to take it away from you. And I think you have to take it away from yourself during the writing process. In fact, the head of publishing, in that retreat, her advice to us was the bottom drawer editing technique. So just put it in the bottom drawer for a good while, as long as you can, and then come back to it and read it fresh, because you'll read it more like a reader. And if you can, print it out in a different font, anything to trick yourself into reading like a reader.
So I'm sure people who are listening to this are really interested in the nuts and bolts of the creative process, the timeline and all of those elements that actually go into writing a novel. Can you unpack that a little bit for us?
Yes. So, and this is when I was asked to do this, I was thinking, wow, an hour to try and share what I know about writing a novel is hard, because it takes a lifetime to figure out how to write a novel, and it's different for everyone, different for every book. But for what it's worth, what I've learned, I guess, is that when you get a good idea, grab hold of it, because they're like little butterflies that skim off, and if you don't sort of snatch it and write it down, you lose it. and it can be an image or just, the ideas can be quite fleeting, but I literally get goosebumps when I get a good idea. So try and grab the idea, and then that hopefully is going to form the beating heart of your novel.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to be, it's going to tell you what's at stake. Hopefully there's some sense of the main protagonist's journey, what they're up against, what they're trying to achieve. So there's that idea. And then the main thing to get right is the start, because you don't want to wait till page 36 to be engaged. People won't bother reading the book.
Mm.
You need to really hook people in straight away. And so an inordinate amount of time goes into getting the start right. Not too much backstory, in that start. And the start might not be the start. You might actually start somewhere down the track of the book.
Mm.
So in terms of starting a novel, finding where to start is a good thing. There are people who approach it differently. Depends a bit on your genre. Like if you're a crime writer or a different sort of genre writer, you might really need to plot it out and then start writing. If you're writing a more literary book, you might actually need to feel your way and write, but at a certain point, and that's in writing worlds, people talk about plotters and pantsers. Do you plot it out or do you fly by the seat of your pants? And I think normally there's a bit of a combination of those things. So, and certainly at a certain point, you have to go, hang on. What am I trying to do here? And chapter by chapter, describe where you're going and where the narrative arc is. Have you got it in the right order? And, have you got, typically you want to have your main peak not too far from the end of your novel, really. And then you've got sort of subplots that arc along underneath that. So at some point you have to I do it on paper. There are software programs to do this.
Of course there is.
But I don't use those. So yeah, you have to plot it out. You have to figure out if it's right. And then you have to rewrite.
Mm.
And rewrite. I can't tell you how many drafts I have of the book.
Has there been in your books then one that's come easier or more easily than others as well in that kind of storytelling?
The one I'm writing right now has come more easily than anything else.
Mm.
It's a new genre for me, and but maybe that's because I've written the others. I don't know, or maybe it's because it's a different kind of book. But yeah, there are lots of different books require different things of you, I think.
Mm.
And but all of them, you have to get the start right. You have to think about who's telling the story. You have to think about, I actually wrote some notes on this. You have to think about whether you're doing it in first person or third person and so on. And I have changed whole books from first to third. The Better Son, I changed the whole book because first person was too claustrophobic.
And did you, just let's unpack that a little bit. Did you, and this is a wonderful book for those people who are listening to Explore, who are not watching us and who've not had a chance yet to read it. Did you get to the end of the book and decide that, or were you kind of like 3 chapters in going, I've got it, the voice wrong?
The voice was okay, but it was, to be honest, I can't remember. No, I've written the whole thing. I changed quite a bit, actually. So The Better Son is a story about a couple of boys who discover a cave in northern Tasmania in Mole Creek. And it was actually inspired by, my kids were quite young and we were up there at Mole Creek and going into one of the caves, and we were told the story of the Bayard brothers who discovered a cave up there. And they mucked around in it for a couple of years before they told their parents. Mm-hmm. And I thought, my goodness, what if one of them had gone missing? And so that's what started off The Better Son. And I got to the end of it, and the way I first did it was I had the story of what happened when the boy went missing in the olden days, back in the 50s, and then what happened when the surviving brother goes back as an older man. I had the two interwoven. Mm-hmm. But when I rewrote it, I pulled it apart, so I've sort of got a little bit of modern day, then backstory, and then modern day. But the person, like I was first person to start with, and because you're in a cave, it was just too claustrophobic. And in a cave, it didn't work. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I changed the whole thing.
So over a period of how long, Katie? Like, did
We're
that
talking
take-
years.
Right. Just in case anybody was thinking that this was going to come off in 6 weeks.
In terms of the whole process, it took a few years, but the rewrite didn't take as long as you'd think.
Terrific. So I think we've kind of heard some of them, but perhaps you can, what are some of the key decisions that you're making as you're going through as well?
Yeah, so things like who's telling a story, you know, do you use, often it's the main protagonist who's telling the story, who the story's about, but it might not be, it might be someone who's witnessing it from the outside. It really depends on what effect you're trying to create or what you're trying to evoke in the reader, really. So yes, there are decisions like that. I mean, there are narrators where you have someone sitting over the top narrating the story and you get to actually go into everybody's heads. So that's sort of an omniscient narrator style of writing. Tense, whether you're telling it all in present tense or past tense. How much you're believing the narrator. Is the narrator reliable, or are they holding things back from the reader? You're also having to figure out what you want to tell the reader when. So sort of building suspense by holding some things back, but giving enough, you know, leaving enough breadcrumbs along the way that it makes sense to them when they get there. Satisfying ending. So yes, I guess it's a bit like a journalism piece. You know, an intro has to answer who, what, where, when, and why. I suppose when you're writing a novel, there's a bit of that. You have to consider, you know, where's the right place to start. It might be the middle of the book that you pull up front. Who's telling a story? You know, when are they telling a story? And get those ideas across about what you want the reader to know when. And who knows what, like somebody in the novel might know something, the reader might know something too, but somebody else in the novel doesn't know. So, I mean, really you're trying to evoke emotion. That's what my science writing, I felt like I need to evoke emotion, which is why I sort of started doing fiction writing too.
Right. And so we've got kind of 4 novels here that you've written now, Katie. Perhaps you can you pick out some of those examples in actually the stories that you've written as well?
Yes. Okay. So, and I was just thinking too, Margaret Atwood just popped into my head. And her key advice to people is, she said, your only job is to hold my attention. You know, she being the reader, hold my attention. So that's what you're trying to do the whole way. All right. So the most challenging one first, which was my PhD. So that's Paris Savages, which doesn't have the same cover anymore. It's got a different cover now. That was tricky because that was my PhD. It was about some Aboriginal people who were taken from Queensland to Europe in the 1880s for exhibition, for ethnographic exhibition. And so it was a time of the formation of quite racist views and how people were represented, and people from all around the world were taken to these people shows. Like there were 35,000 performers in people shows through the 1800s. And that's not something that I knew about until I heard a great radio documentary called Cast Among Strangers, if you're interested, Daniel Browning on ABC. And that was the spark of that idea. I remember distinctly, I was sitting in the car dropping my daughter to ballet class. I heard that story.
So that the inspiration can come anywhere.
And I thought, I have to know more about that. I don't know anything about that.
Was that when you were doing your PhD, starting
before my PhD?
Before your
yeah.
PhD. So
that was sort of the beginning of the idea, but a very challenging story to write. I'm not Aboriginal. I wanted to approach it really respectfully and do the story justice and consulted heavily. But how you tell that story, what voice to tell it in, were really important decisions. So I didn't feel I could write that in a first-person Aboriginal voice. So I've got a young German woman who narrates most of the story, who is the fictional daughter of the man who took the group overseas. But I also didn't want to leave out the Aboriginal story. So I've created a character who tells it in a very imagined way, but not going into the Aboriginal character's thoughts. So it's not a very close point of view. So there's that decision about point of view and how close you get to the writer, to the character's thoughts. So I felt it was an important story to tell, but an important story to tell respectfully. So it took a lot of thinking to try and nut that out.
Was doing your PhD a wonderful opportunity to explore the writing, mechanics of writing, as well as the opportunity to produce a book at the end as well?
Yes, it was. It was fantastic because so I had Danielle Wood as my supervisor, and she was able to be a great sounding board. I was able to write full time, so I was able to really immerse myself in the research as well as the writing, and I got a scholarship to do it, and I was able to go. I had some research funding, so I was able to go to Europe and travel in the footsteps of this Aboriginal troupe and research the story, you know, by going to Hamburg and seeing the place where they probably were taken, and this place that used to be a human zoo that's now a school, and stand in the same place and just think about, I get goosebumps now thinking about there were polar bears and animals in cages, and then there were people on display. And it's not part of history that I knew much about, but it's, you know, it was such a formative time for scientific racism and racism development. And yeah, so it was a wonderful opportunity to do that and to be really immersed in it for a few years.
Do you think then that as a writer you need to have visited the places that you're writing about, or do you think you can write about places that you've not visited but you've done a lot of research about?
Yes, so I mean, ideally there's nothing like, place is really important in writing, and I think we've got such wonderful writers and many alumni who are writers in from Tasmania, and I think place sort of seeps into a lot of our writing. Ideally you go to the place, although when I wrote Pescador's Wake, my toothfish one, I was actually quite heavily pregnant. So I couldn't really hop on a toothfish boat, and I couldn't go to Uruguay, but I did use Google Earth to zoom around the streets in Uruguay and go in the port, and quite conveniently there was a toothfish boat in port in Hobart that had been impounded, so I was able to go on board.
Yeah, I think Google Earth has kind of, you know, some more ways than one opened up the world for us, hasn't it really? Writer's block. Have you had it?
No.
You've never had it? I was about to say, how do you deal with it?
To find some wood to no, I think because time has always been a bit of an issue. Whenever I have got some time, I just write. And I actually think the solution to writer's block, and I don't know, maybe we're all different. But like if I was to sit still and just try and think, okay, I've got this problem, I've hit a plot hole and I don't know what to do. And if I was just sort of trying to nut it out without writing, I don't think I'd figure it out. But if there's something strange that happens between your fingers working and your brain that seems to sort stuff out, at least for me. And so for me, I just write and it sorts it out. The writing sorts it out. And I sometimes end up in a different place than I thought I was going to.
So this is an interesting segue, as you're saying, typing. Do you type or do you longhand?
I do type, but I tend to at a certain point print it out and write on that. But when I am struggling with plot or whatever characters, I do tend to scrawl pretty messily. Actually, an exercise that some people do is to interview certain of their characters, like actually conduct an interview with the character. And I like the idea. I don't know that I've never really gone into it too deeply, but I have tried writing cards. You know, this character has got red hair, that, you know, you tend to have to flesh them out a lot more than you ever see in the book. You have to understand them more than certainly what drives them and what they're afraid of. They're good questions, actually. What's important to them? What are they afraid of? What are they trying to do? What's in their way? You know, those kind of motivation questions I think are good.
So is there a character that you've particularly loved? And they don't have to be a nice character, but somebody a character that you've really thought, yes, you know, they are compelling, or I love them, or I don't want to let go of their story.
I suppose the one, so the better son again, Kip, who's the surviving brother. I think I'm pretty attached to Kip. I'm also really attached to Squid in that story, who's the farmhand. And he's the one, actually that's an interesting one in terms of who's telling the story, because the story, I often use alternating points of view. So one chapter is somebody, next chapter is somebody else, then it's the first person, then it's the second person. And Squid in The Better Son is the farmhand who witnesses all the goings on for these boys and understands it from a distance. So he provides an interesting perspective. And he's a really noble character in the story. So I'm pretty fond of Squid.
Terrific. Yeah, he's good, and a great name too, actually. Which might be interesting, actually. How do you choose names for characters? Do they come easily, or is it something that you really deliberate over?
They sort of come like ideas. They just sort of come, I don't know, they land, but then they sometimes have to get changed. And then actually sometimes I've just written, funny story actually, I've just written, I've written a character at the moment who goes missing, and I had a name, but then I realised it's my son's girlfriend's name. And I had to completely change that name.
So they come to you, but you perhaps can't use them.
No.
Indeed. Katie, in a moment, we're going to go to the questions of people who are joining us on Explore. So I really do encourage you to start thinking about those if you haven't already, and put them in the Q&A function. But perhaps one more question from me. Just what would be your advice to somebody who is considering writing a novel?
The very first writing seminar I went to actually was by a Canadian man, and he made it a joke at the beginning, and he said, if you can think of doing anything else, do that.
Right.
But I don't really subscribe to that. If you have to do it, you have to do it. And my advice is to do something that you are really fascinated by, because you're going to have to live with it for a long time. And you are going to have to want to be interested to know more. And then your passion will show through too. So I don't think there's much point trying to figure out what's the next best thing, because I don't think necessarily publishers even know what's the next best thing. But they know it when they see it. And you sort of hear about that. You sort of hear about everybody getting a bit of a buzz about something or an idea. I think it's really useful to be able to articulate in a sentence or two, a bit like a movie tagline, what your idea and what your novel's about.
It's the elevator pitch.
The elevator pitch. And you need that. You might not know it straight away when you start writing, and that's okay, I think. But certainly by the end, and certainly by the time that you're ready to pitch it, you have to know what that is. And if you don't know what that is, then you can't. And if you can't figure out what that is, you know, you might have a problem in terms of, you might have to go back and think, right, what is this about? So you do need to think about that and nail that. I did write down.
So really it is, you've got to have that passion and understanding of why, because you can't expect anybody else to read your story if you don't believe in it as well.
No. Reading aloud can be really useful, particularly for dialogue, to make sure dialogue is convincing. And to ask yourself with dialogue, because dialogue's hard, but to make sure that you're not using dialogue to have information dumps, that the dialogue is actually something somebody would say. So reading aloud.
So information dumps, you're meaning if you're trying to use the dialogue to progress the story too much?
No, everything has to kind of progress the story, but you don't want dialogue that says, what's an example off the top of my head? I'm not sure if I can think of an example off the top of my head, but Joe hopped in the car and said, I don't know that I can think of an example straight away, but something about, you know, she tells the reader, rather than what she would say to the person beside her, she tells the reader, gee, when I went to school here back in 1974, I had a terrible time at that school, blah, 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 blah. I mean, maybe she would say it like that, but it's got to be convincing and not sort of a way of telling the reader what you want the reader to know, but that that the person wouldn't actually say.
Yeah.
And that's something about research to be careful of too. Like the research that you do, you will see the tip of the iceberg in your book, and all the rest of it was necessary, but it doesn't appear in your book. So be aware of kind of trying to have information dumps of your research in your book that sort of poke through.
And is that the tension then if you're doing your PhD where there's a research element and then you're trying to write a creative story as well?
Yes, it has to be information that progresses the story, not information that sort of shows that you were clever by finding out some cute thing.
And that's obvious, isn't it? You can tell that as a reader that when people are trying to be a bit too clever by half. Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, there's some pieces. Enter competitions, that was another one. Yeah, find what fascinates you. And it might not be necessarily, people sometimes say, write what you know. I don't think you can always do that. Our stories would be quite limited if we always did that. But I think you need to become somewhat of an expert in the topic that you're writing about.
Terrific. Thank you. That's great. Now there is an opportunity for some questions from our people who are listening. So this is live, so excuse me for a moment. An anonymous attendee has asked, how many half-written books are in your bottom drawer right now?
I have one fully finished book in my bottom drawer that will never see the light of day, I think, which is okay. Because
you just knew what's the why?
I don't think it's quite compelling enough probably, but I think it was useful. It's always useful. You always learn things from what you've written. So I think that's all right. And I've got one that's recently completed that I've been working on for a few years now. And I've got one that is one that's almost completed.
And is that the next book?
Yeah, that's the next book.
Right. So really only two that are not going to see the light of day.
One that won't see the light of day.
One that won't see the light of day. Oh, you've got me intrigued now. Thank you. Thanks. That's great. We've got now two connected questions about research. So I'll ask both of them, but I think they're kind of linked. So Cheryl has asked, I want to write a historical novel with actual events in it, but too hesitant in case get facts wrong. Any ideas of starting? And similarly, Janice has said, hi, Catherine. How do you do your research? i.e. do you have other people to do some research for you, or do you do everything yourself? So I think it's really around that research piece and getting things right.
So, no, I don't have anybody to do my research
for
me. No.
I'm sure there's a few people who'd be happy to
all.
volunteer for that.
I do it all. But I enjoy the research and I find it quite necessary to sort of really go into that trove. So fantastic. You can just find out such fascinating things. And in terms of historical fiction and getting the facts wrong, that was a challenge, I suppose, for me for my Paris Savages book. So that's my one about the Aboriginal people taken to Europe. And the way I got around that, or the way I didn't get around it, the way I approached that was to have the world's longest epilogue. In fact, I have an author's note in it as well, I think, that says, this is inspired by a true story, but the characters and so on are fictional. So it's a common, I suppose, situation, isn't it? So many stories are based on fact. I feel like it's good to have a contract with the reader where in the acknowledgements probably you say, this is what we know and this is where I've veered away. So people can have a sense of where the fact and fiction sort of separates.
Yeah.
For me, that's what I like to do for readers. And that's, I guess, what I would suggest doing. Just have something at the end. It doesn't have to be the world's longest one. Mine might be because of the PhD, but it can just be something that enables you to talk to the reader and say, this is what we know, and this is where I've used my imagination to fill in the gaps.
And is this advice as well that your publisher can provide?
Yes.
Or give guidance around the approach that you should be taking?
Yes, they would. Yeah. I mean, there are issues too. If you're writing a book that's based on fact, it's not historical, then, you'd need to sort of get some advice too on making sure that you're not defaming anybody and that kind of thing, if it's a modern book based on fact.
Well, I think many people would be aware there's been quite a controversy with a children's book that was published by Jamie Oliver recently, where he kind of stepped into a space where he was writing about something he didn't know. And I do wonder whether perhaps the advice he received was not robust enough.
No, publishers can help with that, and agents can help with that.
So would you say to Cheryl, who's to go for it then, if she's wanting to, she's hesitant about getting facts wrong, what really your advice would be, make readers aware and...
Yes, yes, I would say don't be too hesitant. I think most historical fiction books, well, I would say almost all of them have got some basis in fact that people are using as their springboard. And that's okay. You're writing a novel, you're not writing a textbook.
Terrific. Okay, well, I hope that's been helpful to Cheryl and Janice as well. Another attendee has asked, and we've kind of talked about this, but obviously there's a lot of interest. If you've written a story, what are the first steps to trying to get it published? So we heard your story, but perhaps there's other advice and ways to get stories published as well.
So, and look, it is hard out there getting published. I had someone tell me recently it was probably the hardest it's been in 30 years. So it's, by no means an easy road. And you do have to be quite resilient, I think. But yeah, so I think entering competitions is good, trying to get shorter things published in literary journals or magazines. So you can, when you do pitch to a publisher, you can say you've been published in these places. It's really important.
And is there a few that you've worked with closely that you could recommend?
So do you mean magazines?
Magazines,
so
yes.
If you're Tasmanian, submit to Island Magazine, 40 South would be ones that you could submit to. You might write something, an essay or an article that's published in Good Weekend, magazine or something like that. So I'd suggest that. Also, publishers have have a look at what sort of books you like and what you're trying to write, and have a look in the back of those in terms of who the agent might be, or who the who publishes that kind of book, so that you can target the right publishers. And then if you're targeting the right publisher, have a look at their website and see whether or not they have submission guidelines, and have a look and see when they might be open for submissions. Because some of them have, the first, I don't know, I'm making this up, but the first Friday of the month, all right, submit, and people actually...
Is that published on their website?
Yes.
And things as well?
Yeah.
Right. That's good advice.
So that's really useful to do, I think.
We had a question that was submitted earlier before this session as well. I think you've talked about it a little bit, but it might be interesting to understand. How do you pick a topic of something to write about as well?
Yeah, so I think it's hard to describe what it is. It's just a feeling of, I do literally get goosebumps. And it's a feeling of fascination with something that just kind of won't let you go, and you want to know more, and you can see that there's a book in it. Yeah. So I don't know how to describe it any more than that, really, except that sometimes they can be, as happened to me lately, I've been on a walk, or I've been doing something, and I get this idea, even it might be for a scene in a book. Or something that a character says, and I think, oh, I won't forget that, because that would be perfect for that. But then you forget it, so you have to somehow grab it and write. I've started writing it in my notes in my phone.
Yeah, great. So
just
good old phones, because they're with you at all times. So you've got a bottom drawer where some unpublished work is sitting, and then you've got a drawer full of ideas as well.
I'm very. I wish I did have a drawer full of ideas. I have not been. Because I just grab whatever's near me. So it'll be the back of an envelope, or it'll be a receipt in the car, so I've got ideas all over the place. They should be in a drawer.
Need to get more organised. So Michael has submitted a really terrific question. We've talked a little bit earlier about how to start a book, but as you noted, it's equally intriguing is the end. How to end a novel. Any thoughts and comments about that?
Yes. So not too far after the main climax, and I'm doing this because it is like a graph, you know, of the peak kind of what's the word? You know, reveal or whatever in the novel. You don't want to you don't want it to drag on too much beyond that. So yes, look for that. I don't think it's necessary to tie everything up with a bow and make it too chocolate boxy, but you want it to be satisfying for the reader.
Have you ever started a book with an idea that's the end of the book?
Yes, I sometimes know the beginning and the end, but not how to get there. Quite frequently.
Right. Any of the books here that you could describe what that looks like as well?
I think probably all of the books there.
Right. So
I'd have signposts along the way. I'd know that they were going to do this, they're going to do that, and they're going to do that. But it's not, because the trouble is if you, for me, if you plot it all out, and it's a very personality-based thing. Some people have to plot. I do a writing course with some other writers, and one of the writers there is definitely a pantser. She flies by the seat of her pants, and she talks about another writer friend of hers who's very much has to plot it out. So it's horses for courses a bit.
Yeah. So I'd imagine writing a book, it must be completely absorbing, and you've described how, you know, ideas are coming to you all the time. But how do you switch off, or do you want to switch off from the creative process?
I don't think it ever switches off. I think it's always in your subconscious. And because I think to be a writer, you have to be an observer. And so I think you need to notice things. In fact, maybe that's something I've learnt too, is that when you're trying to evoke a scene, you need to sort of get as many of your senses happening as you can. So you're describing something that you can see, but, you know, if you can describe what it smells like or what it sounds like or whatever as well, you can make the reader feel much more present. In fact, I was doing that in Paris Savages. I was writing about, you know, that the 1880s in France and Germany, and then a visitor was saying to me, you know, I guess there would have been a lot of manure in the streets from all the horses, and I thought, yeah, that is true, and so that ended up in the book. But and it's an evocative kind of, you know, you can smell that, and it needed to be there, and it hadn't been there. So I do think that's useful to do. Sorry, I've forgotten what the question was.
It was just how you switch off.
Yeah, I don't
which I think the answer is that you don't, actually. Wonderful. So we've got some other questions. I think you mentioned Trove before. So people who are really interested in writing perhaps historical biographies. We know we offer a course here at the university for people to kind of start understanding their history and writing about history. Do you have any advice around how to start writing a memoir or a travel journal or those types of pieces of work as well?
So I haven't written memoir, so I don't want to pretend that I do know how to write memoir. I mean, obviously memoir is going to be in first person, and obviously it's going to be well, you know, again, I guess it's deciding where to start. Do you start at the beginning and write in a chronological order, or do you start now and look back, or something in between? I don't have a lot of advice. I know that there is a book, and I can't think of the name of it, but I can find the name of it. If that person wants to email the alumni office, I can provide the name of that book, because there is a...
Terrific. That was a question from Judith, so please be in contact with us on that.
There's a book that I have on the shelf about writing memoir. It's just not something that although I did write a piece for Good Weekend, which actually I guess was memoir, so a feature piece, and it was about wild medicine. So it was about it was about, actually, it was partly about the caves that I was writing about and deep time and our old forests and how, so it was writing about the effect of those things on me, I suppose, and sort of, I guess it's got to be personal and it's got to be quite, I guess probably intuitively I'd say allow yourself to be a bit vulnerable with memoir.
And similarly, somebody was asking about writing autobiographies as well. Would the advice be?
Yes, I think so. I think there's probably no. I mean, writing, you're vulnerable anyway, and yes, that's just the territory. But even more so for those ones.
So we've got a question now from Ron. Thank you, Ron. What's your daily writing regime, or do you have a daily writing regime?
So
because you also have a job as well as being a published author.
So I may have interacted with some of you. So I do the alumni articles at the university, which is actually a joy. So I get to interview really interesting people about their careers and write feature articles about them. So, but when I'm not doing that, when I'm on my writing days, I don't really have a routine. I might go for a walk just before I start, and then people talk about a ritual of some sort. So it might be as simple as making a cup of tea and doing something. I typically, I guess, would read back over the previous chapter I'd written to get myself back in the writing and back in the zone before I would write forward. Although at the moment what I'm doing is actually editing a book that I've finished. So yes, but even then, if I'm editing, I would go back and reread the previous chapter. And that enables you to just get back into the flow.
Do you have to do that without distraction, like no phones, quiet room?
I don't. I tend to, I've discovered the beauty of headphones with the sound of rain. So I no longer have to be in a room that's quiet. And I've done a lot of writing in the car, you know, when the children are smaller, and I'd be sitting in the car and just snatching time wherever you can find it, really. So I think you can, and I've heard of writers who, you know, they're working full time and they get up and they write for an hour in the morning, and you can actually get a lot done in an hour, surprising amount. So, but I tend to just be a bit frenetic when I'm writing and a bit intense and don't get up and move around enough. I guess I'd advise people to make sure you move around.
Terrific. So this is a wonderful question. Thank you to somebody who submitted this. When did you know you could be a good writer, Katie?
Well, see, I think writers are always the worst critics, and they're always sort of wondering if they've managed to say something as well as they wanted to say it. I think maybe that's what sometimes that's where writer's block comes about, because people are afraid they've got an idea that they think is really good. It might be the same for a painting, and you're concerned that if you that it'll never be as good as your idea of what it will be. So I think that fear, I think that actually probably Elizabeth Gilbert talks about that in Big Magic. You know, the fear of creativity can be what blocks you from going forward. So don't worry so much. Just get it out. I've strayed from the question. The question was
no. Well, when did you know you could be right? You're a good writer, or when did you know you could be?
Yeah, so I've sort of avoided that question. I don't.
Is it the validation though, or is it?
When I first had that writing retreat at Verona, and I was with other writers and they were editors, I think all of us felt like, you know, we were given the time there to write, and I think we all found that really encouraging and affirming.
That's fantastic. Thank you. Now, I know we're nearly to time, but so a couple of quick questions that have come in, or they're not quick questions, actually, they could take up the whole hour, but perhaps quick answers. How do you keep track of ideas to be considered and included in as yet unwritten part of your novel?
Yeah, not very neatly. I need to do better at this. I actually do have a scrapbook, which I'm trying to put all my ideas in, but they come at, the trouble is they come at times where I don't have my scrapbook with me. So maybe it's as simple as that. Have something where maybe you have a practice, where you collate your ideas that you've gathered on receipts in the car, and you actually write them into your book.
Right.
Because they are, you do need to grab them when you get them, and somehow don't lose that idea. But I don't have a brilliant system for it.
Yeah, so perhaps it's advice rather than practice, what you actually do,
Advice to self.
Advice to self, exactly. And we've had a question as well around writing a novel. Do you make an outline first of the whole chapter, or just to write directly what comes to mind? So I think it's that kind of planning thing that we were talking about before.
I have a sense of where the chapter's going and where I need to go, particularly with the one I'm writing at the moment. But I don't have a strict plan. And I think because the danger of that for me is that other ideas crop up when you're writing. And if you're locked into a plan, then you're locked into a plan and you can miss those opportunities. So it's a bit of I think you just need a bit of both. You need enough of a plan to give you some direction and not to sort of waste a lot of effort going off somewhere else, but leave yourself open to taking, having the inspiration that comes. It's a shame if you can't use that. So no, I don't have a strict plan when I start working on a chapter. But other people do. Graham Simpson, for example, he does, and that was my writing friend. He is a writing friend of hers, and she was saying he absolutely has a writing plan.
Yeah. So you've got to do what you feel is comfortable for you as well.
You do.
So we are coming very close to the end of today's Explore, but I think we'll all be interested to know what's next for Dr. Katherine Johnson. I think you said you're editing a book, so when can we hope to see that on our shelves?
Well, it's a process of it being published and it being accepted for publication and it being edited. So, a new book is always at least a year away. And I've got one on the back of that that's completely different again. So
we're looking at two more novels in the next few years.
Two more, but really different. The latest one's even got a crime element, so that's fun.
That sounds amazing. Well, I think everybody will agree it's been a joy to spend an hour with you, Katie, and perhaps we'll have you back for another Explore in the next 12 months or so when the next book comes out, and then when we've got our crime fiction as well. Thank you very much, and I'm sure everybody's joining me, albeit silently, thanking Katie for joining Explore today. There's other opportunities to engage with your alumni community. We have our special event, the 40 Plus Club Luncheon, taking place on the 12th of December. So this is an annual event, and if that's a group that you're in, if you graduated 40 plus years ago, you would be most welcome to join us, and there's information on your screen now. Finally, recording of this afternoon's presentation will be available on our YouTube channel. And as always, the alumni team are here to answer any questions and continue to keep you engaged with your university. But for now, thank you very much for joining us. It's been an absolute pleasure.